So, right now, this morning, May 14th, 2026, while Donald Trump is in Beijing negotiating with Xi Jinping for rare earth minerals from China, Mark Carney is standing at a podium on Parliament Hill in Ottawa announcing the National Electricity Agenda, the most significant build-out of Canada's national electricity grid in the country's history, a plan to more than double the capacity of Canada's power grid, and the formal activation of the East-West electricity architecture that will make Canada's energy system structurally independent of American control for the first time since Confederation. The strategy has been weeks delayed. It was supposed to be released in late March. It wasn't. It was supposed to come with the spring economic update on April 28th. It didn't. And this morning, on the day Trump is in Beijing, and the world's attention is focused on a bilateral summit between the two largest economies on Earth, Canada's Prime Minister is at Parliament Hill announcing the plan that every provincial premier, every utility company, every industrial energy consumer, and every American grid operator in the northern tier states needs to understand before the end of this week. Because the plan that Carney is announcing today is not a green energy vision statement. It is not a climate aspiration document. It is the architectural blueprint for a Canadian electricity system that no longer runs primarily north-south toward the United States. It runs east-west, across Canada, province to province. Hydro from Quebec reaching Alberta, wind from Saskatchewan reaching Ontario, nuclear from New Brunswick reaching Nova Scotia. A connected, resilient, east-west energy spine that Canada has never had, that Trump's energy threats made urgently necessary, and that Carney has been building towards since the specific week in March 2025 when Ontario Premier Doug Ford announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports to New York, Minnesota, and Michigan, and Trump responded by threatening to declare a national electricity emergency in the 3 states Ontario targeted, and calling it unimaginable that Canada would stoop so low as to use electricity as a bargaining chip. Trump called the electricity threat a bargaining chip. The plan Carney is announcing today transforms the bargaining chip into the national backbone. The energy that Trump feared Canada would cut off is now going to be doubled, expanded, east-west connected, and anchored in a grid architecture that serves Canada's own economy first and the American market on Canada's own terms. Warren Buffett said this week's announcement is the kind of infrastructure decision that most governments lack the political clarity to make, and that only arrives when the external threat makes the internal vulnerability undeniable. Trump threatened Canada's energy. Canada is building a grid that makes the threat irrelevant. Hit subscribe because the National Electricity Agenda is being released this morning, Alberta's carbon pricing agreement with Ottawa is expected tomorrow, and the industrial energy infrastructure that Canada is announcing today is the permanent structural answer to 17 months of American energy threats. Let me take you through exactly what triggered this moment, why Canada's existing electricity architecture made the threat possible in the first place, and why the grid plan that Carney is announcing today is the most consequential energy sovereignty decision Canada has made in a century. The energy confrontation that lit the urgency under today's announcement happened in March 2025, in the first weeks of the trade war's escalation, and it exposed a structural vulnerability in Canada's electricity system that most Canadians had not previously thought about, and that the American administration had also not fully understood until Ontario turned it into a weapon. Ontario Premier Doug Ford, responding to Trump's 25% tariffs on Canadian goods, announced a 25% surcharge on electricity exports from Ontario to Michigan, Minnesota, and New York, the 3 American states that receive power from Ontario's grid, power that heats homes in Detroit and lights factories in Minneapolis and runs data centers in the Hudson Valley. Power that those states had been receiving for decades through the integrated north-south transmission infrastructure that defines Canada's electricity system in its current form. Ford's surcharge was calibrated precisely to produce visible consequences for American consumers. He said it could raise utility bills by $100 per month in the affected states. Trump's response was immediate and disproportionate. He threatened a 25% tariff on Canadian electricity imports to the United States. Then he threatened to raise steel and aluminum tariffs from 25% to 50%. He threatened to declare a national electricity emergency in Michigan, Minnesota, and New York. He posted on Truth Social, "Can you imagine Canada stooping so low as to use electricity that so affects the life of innocent people as a bargaining chip and threat?" The standoff lasted 48 hours. Trump backed down. Ontario suspended the surcharge. Commerce Secretary Lutnick flew to negotiate with Ford and LeBlanc. And Carney, who had just taken office as Prime Minister, said the words that are now the foundation of every energy policy decision his government has made since. An attack on Canadian workers, families, and businesses. And then, "My government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect and make credible, reliable commitments to free and fair trade." The electricity confrontation resolved, but what it had exposed did not go away. It had exposed that Canada's electricity system, built over a century of provincial development, with each province connecting primarily south to American markets rather than east to its Canadian neighbors, was structurally dependent on American goodwill in a way that no sovereign energy strategy could tolerate indefinitely. The specific geometry of Canada's electricity system is the detail that makes the national electricity agenda's east-west ambition so consequential, because most people who think about Canadian electricity think about it as a supply question rather than a connectivity question. Canada has abundant electricity supply. Quebec's hydroelectric system is one of the largest in the world. British Columbia's Site C and other hydroelectric facilities generate massive clean power capacity. Manitoba's hydro system is surplus to provincial needs and currently sells power to neighboring American states. Ontario's nuclear fleet, the largest in Canada, generates approximately 50% of the province's electricity with zero emissions from its CANDU reactors. Alberta's grid is transitioning from coal toward natural gas, wind, and emerging nuclear. Nova Scotia and New Brunswick have Atlantic tidal and wind resources whose full potential has never been tapped at scale. The supply is not Canada's electricity problem. The connectivity is. The Canadian press confirmed it in its coverage this morning. Currently, most of Canada's electricity connections go north-south, not east-west, giving provinces limited capacity to share power generation with each other. Canada has over 30 cross-border transmission lines connecting to the American grid. The number of interprovincial electricity connections is a fraction of that. What this means operationally is that a province experiencing a supply shortage cannot easily draw from its Canadian neighbor to the east or west. It draws from the American grid instead. And a province with surplus clean power cannot easily export it to Canadian neighbors who need it. It exports to American states instead. Ontario's surplus nuclear power has historically gone to New York and Michigan rather than to Quebec or Manitoba. Quebec's surplus hydro has gone to New England rather than to Ontario or the Maritimes. The surplus stays in Canadian hands only in the sense that Hydro-Quebec or Ontario power generation collects the revenue. The physical power crosses south, enters the American grid, and the price is set by American market conditions rather than by Canadian regulatory frameworks. This architecture, which made commercial sense for individual provinces operating their grids to maximize revenue, created at the national level a structural energy dependency on American transmission infrastructure, American market access, and American regulatory willingness to accept Canadian power. Ford's 25% electricity surcharge worked as a trade weapon because Ontario's power had nowhere to go inside Canada that didn't involve American infrastructure. The weapon's effectiveness was the proof of the vulnerability. Carney said it publicly in January 2026 at the World Economic Forum in Davos, before a room full of international investors and finance ministers, before he had finalized the strategy being announced today. In the coming weeks, the federal government will release a draft of our national electricity strategy. Our objective is to more than double the size of Canada's electricity grid. The statement was precise. More than double, not grow, not expand. More than double. The Canadian Nuclear Association had commissioned a study the previous year finding that Canada's electricity demand would double or triple by 2050, driven by electric vehicle adoption, AI data center energy requirements, industrial electrification, and population growth. Carney's objective of more than doubling the grid is the specific response to that demand projection, grounded in the same analysis that makes the east-west connectivity question urgent. Doubling supply without doubling east-west connectivity would produce a grid with more power and the same structural dependency. Doubling supply while building the east-west spine produces something fundamentally different, a grid where Canadian power moves freely between Canadian provinces, where Quebec's hydro balances Alberta's wind, where Ontario's nuclear anchors the central spine, where BC's hydroelectric capacity can reach Saskatchewan in drought years, and where the entire Canadian electricity system has the internal resilience to manage a trade war with its southern neighbor without any individual province being forced to export south or import south to keep the lights on. That is the plan Carney is announcing today. The existing projects that are already underway give the plan's ambition its physical foundation, because the National Electricity Agenda is not a document describing what might be built. It is the architectural framework for projects that are already in progress, and that the federal fiscal tools Carney put in place in the November 2025 budget are already financing. The Wassakanadal Reliability Intertie between Nova Scotia and New Brunswick is a 345 kilovolt double-circuit line spanning 160 kilometers, supported by $217 million in infrastructure bank equity, connecting the Atlantic provinces in a way that reduces their individual dependence on American New England grid connections. British Columbia and Alberta have a legislated plan to restore nearly 1 gigawatt of transfer capacity on their 500 kilovolt AC interconnection by 2026, reversing years of constraint from aging equipment and operational limits. Alberta and Saskatchewan are replacing and uprating shared 230 kilovolt assets to improve cross-border Canadian flows and strengthen reliability across the Prairie Seam. Ontario and Quebec are examining expansion of their 315 kilovolt and 500 kilovolt interconnections, with options for advanced back-to-back converter technology to manage asynchronous grid operation and facilitate interprovincial trade. These are not aspirational future projects. They are existing engineering commitments with identified financing, regulatory pathways, and construction timelines. What the National Electricity Agenda provides is the federal coordinating architecture that connects these individual provincial and interprovincial projects into a single coherent national system, with the federal fiscal tools to fill the financing gaps that provincial utilities and private developers cannot bridge alone. Those fiscal tools are already in place, and their design reveals the sophistication of the energy sovereignty strategy that Carney has been building since taking office. The Clean Electricity Investment Tax Credit, a 15% refundable credit on new generation, storage, and interprovincial transmission projects, was embedded in the November 2025 budget. 15% refundable means that a company building an interprovincial transmission line receives 15% of the capital cost back from the federal government as cash, regardless of whether it has taxable income in the year of the investment. This specifically benefits utilities with limited tax exposure, which are most major Canadian electricity utilities, and Indigenous-owned energy enterprises, whose ownership structures often preclude using non-refundable tax credits. The credit applies to generation, including hydroelectric, nuclear, wind, and solar. It applies to storage, including battery systems and pumped hydro facilities. And it applies to interprovincial transmission, the specific infrastructure gap that the East-West grid requires. The Clean Technica analysis called the credit the seed of a connected modern grid that could knit together the regional islands of Canadian electricity into a single low-carbon engine for the electrified economy ahead. The Canada Infrastructure Bank expansion from $35 billion to $45 billion in statutory capital, with a broader mandate to invest in nation-building projects, is the patient capital mechanism that anchors the multi-jurisdictional partnerships that interprovincial high-voltage direct current lines require. HVDC technology, which is the specific infrastructure needed for efficient long-distance east-west transmission across Canada's vast geography, requires investment structures that combine federal patient capital with provincial and Indigenous equity in projects whose returns arrive over decades rather than quarters. The Infrastructure Bank can provide equity and blended financing at exactly those timelines. Together, the tax credit and the Infrastructure Bank expansion are the fiscal architecture of the East-West grid's first decade of construction. They were put in place before the National Electricity Agenda's formal release today because Carney understood, as a former central banker who spent his career designing institutional frameworks for long-horizon investment, that the fiscal tools must precede the institutional announcement, not follow it. You build the foundation before you lay the floor. The nuclear dimension of the National Electricity Agenda is the element that gives the doubling plan its most structurally durable pillar. Energy Minister Tim Hodgson committed on April 29th to publish a nuclear strategy before the end of 2026, covering both domestic nuclear power generation and Canada's positioning as a global nuclear technology and fuel supplier. The Alberta deal that Carney and Premier Danielle Smith are advancing, confirmed at their May 8th meeting in Ottawa, includes the development of Alberta's own nuclear generation strategy, with the goal of bringing nuclear power to Alberta's grid by 2050. Alberta has never had nuclear power. Alberta's grid has run on coal, then increasingly on natural gas and wind, with nuclear absent from its mix. Adding nuclear to Alberta's electricity portfolio by 2050 changes the fundamental energy arithmetic of the Western Canadian grid and eliminates the constraint that has made Alberta dependent on natural gas baseload in a way that exposes it to natural gas price volatility and carbon emissions. The small modular reactors that Ontario Power Generation is developing at Darlington, the advanced CANDU technology that AtkinsRéalis is designing for potential domestic and export use, and the federal loan of $304 million to support that next-generation CANDU development are all pieces of a nuclear expansion that the National Electricity Agenda is placing into a national strategic context for the first time. Canada supplies 33% of uranium to American nuclear reactors. Canada has 17 CANDU reactors of its own. Canada's nuclear technology is exported to South Korea, China, Argentina, Pakistan, and Romania. The nuclear strategy that Hodgson will publish before year's end will connect Canada's resource endowment, its reactor technology, its fuel cycle infrastructure, and its grid expansion plans into the most comprehensive nuclear energy positioning any Canadian government has attempted in 50 years. The demand side of the National Electricity Agenda is where the strategy's timing becomes most precisely calibrated against the specific pressures driving Canadian electricity demand upward. Demand for electricity in Canada is soaring with multiple new requirements, including from electric vehicles, data centers, and defense industrial production. That is not boilerplate environmental language. That is the description of three specific new demand categories, each of which is a direct consequence of the policy decisions Carney's government has made in the 17 months since taking office. Electric vehicle adoption is being driven by the Canada-China EV deal that lowered tariffs on Chinese EVs from 100% to 6.1%, increasing the pace at which Canadians can access affordable electric vehicles. Data center energy demand is being driven by the $13.7 billion Microsoft investment and the broader Canadian digital sovereignty strategy that is attracting hyperscale AI and cloud computing infrastructure to Canadian locations. Defense industrial production demand is being driven by the $180 billion defense procurement plan, the $290 billion infrastructure commitment, and the Defense, Security, and Resilience Bank headquarters that 19 allied nations unanimously chose Canada to host. These are not abstract growth projections. They are the specific energy demand consequences of decisions Carney has already made and implemented. The electricity grid needs to double not because of generic electrification trends, but because of the specific industrial and commercial activity that Carney's own policy architecture is generating. The National Electricity Agenda is in this sense the capstone of a policy strategy that has been building its own demand for the energy infrastructure it is now announcing. The Chinese EV deal created EV demand. The Microsoft deal created data center demand. The DSRB created defense industrial demand. And the National Electricity Agenda creates the supply architecture to serve all of them from Canadian generation on Canadian transmission at Canadian prices under Canadian regulatory authority. Warren Buffett's analysis of the energy sovereignty dimension of the National Electricity Agenda addresses the structural question that the political framing of individual policy announcements consistently obscures. In 70 years of business, Buffett said, I have watched every major infrastructure investment decision in every country I've studied carefully, and the pattern that produces transformational outcomes is always the same. The threat arrives. The vulnerability is exposed. The response that turns the threat into an opportunity for transformational investment is the response that only disciplined governments make, because undisciplined governments patch the immediate problem rather than redesign the system. Ford threatened to cut electricity to New York. Trump called it unconscionable. Both of them revealed, in the 48 hours of the confrontation, that Canada's electricity system was designed to serve North-South commercial relationships rather than East-West national energy security. A patching government would have used that revelation to negotiate a truce and move on. A transformational government would use it to redesign the system. He paused. Carney used it to announce the biggest national grid build-out in Canadian history. The 30,000 jobs by 2028, the 100,000 jobs by 2050. The lower energy costs for 70% of Canadian households. All of that is the compound return on responding to a 48-hour electricity surcharge confrontation with a national energy sovereignty strategy rather than a negotiated truce. A truce would have preserved the vulnerability. The strategy eliminates it. And once an east-west electricity backbone is built, the structural leverage that American grid operators had over individual Canadian provinces disappears permanently. You cannot threaten a national emergency in Michigan over Ontario electricity exports when Ontario has interprovincial connections that allow it to redirect its surplus east to Quebec rather than south to Detroit. The surcharge weapon that Ford deployed and Trump matched in March 2025 cannot be deployed in a Canada where the east-west grid exists, because the east-west grid is the evidence that the north-south dependence has ended. The Alberta dimension of today's announcement is the specific political achievement that makes the National Electricity Agenda a national policy rather than a federal wish list. Alberta has historically resisted federal energy policy on sovereignty grounds that are embedded in the constitutional arithmetic of Canadian federalism and in the specific historical grievance of the National Energy Program of 1980, the Pierre Trudeau-era federal intervention in Alberta's oil and gas revenues that left a generational scar in the provincial political culture. Every federal energy initiative since 1980 has had to navigate the Alberta question. Carney's approach has been to negotiate with Alberta rather than impose on it. The May 8th meeting with Premier Danielle Smith produced the shift from if a pipeline deal gets signed to when it gets signed. The Alberta Carbon Pricing Agreement expected tomorrow is the federal-provincial deal that unlocks the clean electricity investment frameworks in Alberta that the National Electricity Agenda requires to function as a national rather than an 11-province strategy. A national electricity agenda that does not include Alberta's grid is not a national strategy. It is a Canadian electricity plan with a very large gap in the middle. Alberta's 4.5 million people represent 11% of Canada's population and a larger share of its industrial electricity demand, given the province's energy-intensive resource sector. Alberta's grid connection to Saskatchewan is one of the seams that the east-west backbone must cross. And Alberta's emerging nuclear ambitions, confirmed in the May 8th meeting, make it an essential participant in the long-term grid doubling, rather than a holdout to be worked around. Tomorrow's carbon pricing agreement between Ottawa and Alberta is the political prerequisite that today's National Electricity Agenda announces without yet having formally confirmed. The sequence is deliberate: announce the national vision, confirm the provincial partnerships in the days that follow. Build the political architecture from the federal framework down to the provincial commitments rather than from the provincial commitments up to the federal framework. The American grid dimension of the national electricity agenda is the element that receives the least coverage in Canadian domestic policy discussions and that carries the most strategic weight for the bilateral relationship. Canada's electricity system and America's electricity system are deeply physically integrated. The four major North American grid regions, the Eastern Interconnection, the Western Interconnection, the Texas Interconnection, and the Quebec Interconnection, include significant Canadian territory and Canadian generation capacity. Ontario and Quebec feed power into the Eastern Interconnection. British Columbia feeds power into the Western Interconnection. The integration means that Canadian electricity decisions have immediate consequences for American grid stability, and American policy decisions have immediate consequences for Canadian grid revenue. The 30-plus cross-border transmission lines that currently define Canada's electricity export architecture are physical cables whose flows are governed by bilateral regulatory arrangements between Canadian provinces and American states, overseen by the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, a joint U.S.-Canada organization. The east-west grid that Carney is building does not require the dismantling of those cross-border connections. It simply adds interprovincial capacity that Canada does not currently have. A Canada with both robust north-south connections and a robust east-west backbone is a Canada that can choose, in any given market condition, which direction its surplus power flows. It can export south when American prices are attractive and share east-west when Canadian provincial needs are higher. It can absorb American power during Canadian demand peaks and redirect Canadian surpluses to Canadian neighbors rather than American buyers when Canadian grid stability requires it. That optionality is what the current architecture lacks. And optionality, in the vocabulary of the energy security confrontation that Trump's threat activated, is the difference between a country whose energy policy is shaped by its relationship with its southern neighbor and a country whose energy policy is shaped by its national interest. The former is what Canada has been for a century. The latter is what the national electricity agenda is building. The CP24 exclusive, published 3 hours ago, provides the employment numbers that make the policy concrete for the 70% of Canadian households whose energy bills are projected to fall by 2050 under the plan. Nearly 30,000 new jobs by the end of 2028, 100,000 more by 2050. The 30,000 by 2028 figure is the near-term construction employment driven by the transmission projects, the generation additions, and the storage infrastructure that the first phase of the grid doubling requires. It is the direct employment counterpart to the 3,500 DSRB jobs, the 600 jobs from Whirlpool's Ohio equivalent Canadian expansion, and the employment commitments attached to the Microsoft $13.7 billion investment. Carney is assembling an employment portfolio from a set of interlocking policy decisions, each of which reinforces the others. The DSRB creates defense finance jobs. The Microsoft deal creates AI and cloud jobs. The national electricity agenda creates clean energy construction jobs. The internal trade liberalization creates retail and logistics jobs. The critical minerals strategy creates mining and processing jobs. No single one of these policy decisions is a jobs program. Each is a strategic investment with a jobs consequence. And the cumulative consequence, assembled across 17 months of Carney's government, is a Canadian economic development architecture whose employment creation does not depend on American market access, American trade policy approval, or American political mood. So here is where we stand. Today, May 14, 2026, Mark Carney is at Parliament Hill announcing the National Electricity Agenda, the biggest national grid build-out in Canadian history, a plan to more than double the capacity of Canada's power grid by 2050, creating an east-west electricity backbone that replaces the north-south architecture through which the March 2025 electricity confrontation with the Trump administration revealed Canada's structural dependence. The plan will lower energy costs for 70% of Canadian households by 2050. It will create 30,000 jobs by 2028 and 100,000 by 2050. It is being built on the fiscal foundation of the 15% Clean Electricity Investment Tax Credit and the $45 billion Canada Infrastructure Bank. It is anchored by existing projects including the BC-Alberta 500 kV interconnection, the Alberta-Saskatchewan 230 kV uprating, the Ontario-Quebec HVDC corridor planning, and the Nova Scotia-New Brunswick-Wassakanadal intertie. It is accompanied by a nuclear strategy coming before year's end, an Alberta nuclear deal targeting 2050, and an Alberta carbon pricing agreement expected tomorrow. Trump threatened Canada's energy in March 2025 with national emergency declarations and 50% steel tariff escalations when Ontario's electricity surcharge exposed the north-south dependence. Carney responded with the forward policy commitment that is now a completed architecture. He called Ontario's electricity use an attack on Canadian workers, families, and businesses, and kept Canada's tariffs in place until the Americans showed respect. And simultaneously, he began building the hidden grid, the east-west spine, the architecture that makes the threat structurally impossible to repeat, because the grid no longer depends on American goodwill to function as a national system. Can the United States use energy as a trade weapon against a country that is doubling its east-west electricity capacity? Can the threat of denying American grid access to Canadian power produce the political pressure it produced in March 2025 once the interprovincial connections exist that make that access optional rather than essential for each province? And the question that the national electricity agenda answers in concrete and transmission cable rather than in diplomatic statements or tariff announcements. What happens to the leverage of a trade threat when the infrastructure that gave the threat its force is replaced by the infrastructure that makes the threat irrelevant? Trump threatened energy. Carney activated the national electricity agenda. The east-west grid is the hidden protocol. And it is being announced today, while Trump is in Beijing asking for minerals from China, from the country that has been quietly building the infrastructure to make the request unnecessary.